So this is going to be our overview of Unit 4, at least a little bit, and then you're going to dive in and start doing some self-study work for the chapter quizzes. Classical period, which I would say you want to know the dates first. 1750, which is the death of Bach, to about 1820. What can we say that will help put all of this into a format that's understandable? First is that in the classical period, partly due to the zeitgeist or philosophical spirit of the times, the way people were thinking, and also just refinements on and progression through the Baroque music into this newer style, we have an incredibly homogeneous style of music. What we mean by that is that if you were to play music from the classical period, right, this 1750 to 1820, for your average person who does not know this music very, very well, you could play almost any piece of this music. You could play a similar kind of piece of music from any number of composers. So we could take a concerto from Mozart, Haydn, early Beethoven, and then Schubert, early Schubert, and any other number of people as well. And nobody could tell the difference if they haven't been trained to think about this a little bit. That's because by the time we get to the classical period, philosophy on music, and many things actually in the culture, have become set. They say this is what good music is like, and this is the attributes of it. And that's because music has centered as a cultural, in a cultural place in Vienna, right? They call it the Viennese school. And there's four landmark composers, Mozart and Haydn. Haydn's first, he's oldest, and then Mozart is younger, he comes along, although Mozart dies at a young age. And then Beethoven is in there, and Beethoven and Schubert have their feet in the classical era and then bridges into the Romantic next period. So we will talk in more specifics about features of classical music, but we just want to understand that to begin with. If it all sounds the same to you, that's because it's got incredible similar characteristics. The more we study and look at the composers and their individual pieces, the more you'll find that there are idiosyncratic differences. But there was sort of like this is what good music sounds like standard or way of thinking at the time. So the first chapter talks about how this is the Age of Enlightenment, and we're trying to get away from some of the intemperance of the Baroque and previous periods, where we have people writing about basically things like the rule of law and sort of rights for people that are not aristocracy. I'm going to let you read through the four leaders, the cultural setting, and give this information out of the book for your self-study quizzes. But we can see it reflected in the Constitution of the United States, and even in the architecture that we have here. You might say, well, how does architecture show that? Well, here's the Supreme Court building, which is a product of this time and thinking. If you look, it's got points of symmetry, not very, very radical or steep angles and things in terms of like the buildings and things. It reflects Greek and Roman philosophy, architecture, and art, but it's very comprehensible in terms of form, and it's very unextreme. And we see that in the architecture that's built at the time, which is a reflection of all these ideas. It sums it into here, philosophy of the times, that all the stuff up to this point is trying to talk about, which is reason and logic are the way to truth. And it says emotions are false and misleading. That's not exactly true. It's not that they were cold and unfeeling people, but the idea that law and logic is the way to help us make sure that we have a more just and also progressive place is paramount. So yes, emotions are important and such. The way we feel are good, but we don't base law or society on how we feel after we had lunch or something like that. It's not you want your magistrates and your judges to judge fairly and not because they feel a certain way. So along that line, the universe is governed by permanent laws that you can't alter. What's true is true. Okay, and therefore we should be using intellect and logic and thought. um, uh, in terms of like what we're doing here, not just for society, but also in art and music as well. Now, we're going to skip over Rococo style, except for just a couple questions you might get on the test. So it's a bridging style into the classical period, where we can see that the Baroque is being turned into more of a classical style. But we are going to talk about characteristics of classical music. Okay. Um, Classical music. Well, I think the first question you want to ask yourself is, how is it different from Baroque music? We're still using um, major and minor key systems. We're still changing keys. We're still doing all those kind of things. But how does it become more rational, more intellectual, more comprehensible? And so each one of these we should think about both in what it is, but how does it change? So first thing is that the melodies are not um, extreme or unbalanced. They are, for the most part, pleasant and very tuneful. You know many famous melodies from this times. If I go bum 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 bum, you probably go bum 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 bum, and you can see that there are two halves. They balance each other out. One goes up, and the other one logically goes down, but it's the same idea, right? And it's tuneful. It can be sung. Um, they have this sort of question and answer uh, thing about them. Homophony. Well, it's kind of funny because homophony was featured as an essential part of recitative developed for opera out of Greek monody in the Baroque period. But then you also saw we had great counterpoint in the fugues and polyphony and things like that. So one of the things that happens in the classical period is most music tended to be homophonic. They still have polyphonic sections and things like that. They're aware of the technique of fugues and things from before, and it can be done. But if we make sure that our texture for instance, instrumental pieces and such or singing is mainly homophonic, then there's a melody, which is a theme that you can keep track of, right? The texture simplifies itself so we can understand what we're listening to and then identify where we're at. Harmony. Well, harmony is the same structure as in the Baroque period, okay? But they get rid of the continuo part, okay? So that harpsichord sound goes away. That's not more or less complicated, but they change chords less frequently. We call this harmonic rhythm, the rate at which chords change. They don't use that term in here, but you want to remember harmonic rhythm is the rate or how frequently chords change in a music, okay? And that happens, the harmonic rhythm gets slower or they change less frequently. So you can hear chord changes now more easily. It's another way it's more comprehensible because they happen less often. So the when they do change, you can hear it more readily. Um, Same sort of rhythmic things, except maybe they're not quite as driving as some of the Baroque music. Now here's where we get into two very big differences from the Baroque period. In the Baroque period, we had terraced dynamics, loud and quiet, and you could get other nuanced dynamics out of other things, like you could up the energy level by the amount that's being played, or you could put things into more extreme ranges of instruments or voices, so they had to have a timbral or color way of adding energy. By the time we get to the classical period, one of the things that they do, they have simplified all these other things that we've talked about up till now. So one thing they do to keep interest going and more of a refinement is they introduce the idea of graduated dynamics. So the word crescendo, remember back from our first unit, to get louder gradually, and decrescendo, to get quieter gradually. Okay, these are things that are actually introduced and written into the music and thought of specifically, so that they're notated as part of the compositional process to think about that. The other thing is the orchestra. It's not the giant romantic orchestra that you've seen in big films and on YouTube or even cartoons and things like that. But we are getting bigger. We have more strings than we did in the Baroque period, and now we're starting to add pairs of woodwinds, pairs of brasses, not the low brass too much, and not too much in the way of percussion. That will get filled out more in the Romantic era. But we do have this, and then public concerts began during this time in the sense that they were not always closed for invited guests. That continues on as well, closed concerts for aristocracy, nobility, but public concerts, people start buying tickets and getting to see these things. Remember, this is their primary form of entertainment. That includes not just orchestras and things, but opera and things as well, and we'll see that that changes as well. But here it is. This is actually what I wanted to get to. Form. And this is the thing I want you to take away from this overview. Everything in this unit is about form. The simplification of the texture, the slowing down of the chords, the simple tuneful melodies that are question and answer, all this kind of stuff allows us to listen to themes and their transformations. That means that we can be cognizant of where we are in a piece of music at any given moment, i.e., we're thinking about the form or shape of the music. Okay? So, one of the things that happens during the classical period as an outgrowth of the Baroque, and also as an aesthetic of intellectual sort of like logic and pursuit during this time period, is that forms become highly sophisticated, but also that's one of the primary things we listen for. Pieces get longer, but just like the fugue, if you know where you're at, it's not that you're lost and you lose attention. Understanding and hearing the forms of the music, understanding where we are and what's going on, becomes a primary focus of classical music. And even though it doesn't state that explicitly in these chapters, I'd like to just show you they're always talking about form. So we talk about chapter 16, sonata form. That's the form, okay? And the whole discussion is about sonata form, the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation, the third part of the form, okay? Other aspects of form. So right away, and then it says the concerto, and it says, we've talked about concerto before, but now we're going to talk about the classical concerto, which is a solo concerto. And the first thing that they actually talk about is how this concerto form differs from typical sonatas. And so they start saying, well, it's different because it has one of these and one of those and one of those. It's all talking about form. Even when it gets to the other movements, second movement is what kind of form, right? Third movement is what kind of form. So, and this goes through the whole of this set. We'll only touch lightly on opera because we've talked about opera already in its origin. So we'll talk about just how it changes. We won't spend too much time on chapter 18. It's great. But, and then, sorry, phone went off. And then when it gets to chamber music, look, it says, after it talks about chamber music, then it talks about sonata form again. And then it talks about middle movement forms like the minuet and trio, which it starts talking about form. It's always about form. When it talks about a specific piece of music, clarinet quintet, and it says the first movement is this form. The second movement, it talks about, well, the form, because it's talking about A sections and B sections. The third movement is a minuet and trio, which we've learned is a form. And the fourth movement could be, well, it talks about theme and variations, which is a form, right? It's always about form. How do we, and then piano sonatas, piano music, okay? Then Beethoven, who's a bridging character, okay, between the classical era and the Romantic era. And even here we'll talk, amongst other of his innovations, how he messes with form. All right, so how do we hear forms? What we want to do is we want to first, just like with ritornello, the concertos, the ritornello idea of hearing a main theme. We want to do the same here. We want to get good at hearing when we approach a piece of music the themes, and then we learn the basics about the form, and we learn to hear the themes introduced and then messed with, and the key changes as well. Messed is not the right word, but altered with, and then they go on like that. All right, that's your overview. You can get started on the chapters. I'm gonna switch over and do one more video today, which is about the final. So I know that we're just sort of in the very beginnings of the second half of the term, but final. So, all right, there you go.